Hi, everyone, and welcome to Katie Couric. The financial crisis of 2008 cost millions of people their jobs, their savings, in many cases, their homes. The ripple effects are still being felt today as the global economy tries to recover. A new documentary called Inside Job examines the origins of this crisis like a great whodunit. Charles Ferguson is an Oscar-nominated filmmaker, and he produced and directed Inside Job. And as always, we'd like to thank the sponsor of our web show, Dove. Charles, nice to see you. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about sort of the overall message of the film. I think it's pretty frightening and depressing because you get the impression that it was all about greed on the part of government regulators, academics, bank executives, and maybe to a certain extent, the average citizen. Is this what happened here? Was this sort of greed, unbridled greed, Gordon Gekko to the nth degree?
Well, to a large extent it was, yes. Over the last 30 years, in large measure because of lobbying from Wall Street, the United States deregulated its financial system. And, you know, if you don't control people and hundreds of billions of dollars are available to them, then it turns out they're prepared to behave very unethically.
And it's really not the fault, your film contends, or it suggests anyway, of Democrats or Republicans. It's a very large systemic failure, is it not?
Well, I would say it's the fault both of Democrats and Republicans. I wouldn't say it's not
either of their fault.
Yeah,
there's enough blame to go around.
Yes, yeah, it is a thoroughly bipartisan problem. And both parties, the leadership of both parties, participated in this deregulation and also profited from it politically and also profited from it in some cases individually and financially.
Let's deconstruct what happened for a moment, starting with the 1980s. Now, before President Reagan, banks were basically private partnerships. Let's take a look.
Excuse me, investment banks.
Investment banks were for the most part, private partnerships. Let's take a look at how things started to change, and here's a clip from the documentary.
In the 1980s, the financial industry exploded. The investment banks went public, giving them huge amounts of stockholder money. People on Wall Street started getting rich.
I had a friend who was a bond trader at Merrill Lynch in the 1970s. He had a job as a train conductor at night because he had 3 kids and couldn't support them on what a bond trader made. By 1986, he was making millions of dollars and thought it was because he was smart.
So what happened? How did things change and why?
Well, the deregulation of the financial system began in the early 1980s in the Reagan administration. And as the financial system deregulated, it also consolidated, and it became dominated by a relatively small number of financial conglomerates and investment banks, and it started making enormous amounts of money. And it also started causing financial crises for the first time since the Depression. The first one was in the late 1980s, the S&L scandals, which cost the American taxpayer about $150 billion, also cost many people their savings. At the time, that was thought to be a gigantic amount of money. Now, this is the third wave. The most recent crisis is the third wave of financial crises since deregulation began. And this one has cost us several $1 trillion and counting.
And what was the political or economic impetus of deregulation in the early 80s?
Well, it came from...
I mean, it's a sort of a political philosophy.
Political and economic philosophy, yes. Part of this did come from the economics discipline. And part of it came from people who sincerely believed that deregulated, completely free markets were in fact optimal. There was some sincere belief about that, mistaken but sincere. There was also, however, a very significant dose of corruption. One thing that the film goes into that's not widely known is that over the past 30 years, Wall Street has penetrated and co-opted and corrupted academia and the economics discipline.
That was very interesting, I thought. We're going to talk about that. And, well, we might as well talk about it now. Basically, you bring out how a lot of these academics who are really paid to evaluate, or asked to evaluate the economic health of either countries or companies or systems, are on the payroll of places where they're encouraged to take on a particular position. Is that accurate?
Yes. In fact, it's often much more direct than that. Frequently, very prominent academics are actually paid to testify in Congress. They're paid to advocate industry positions in regulatory proceedings. They're paid to write papers. It's actually rather shocking.
Except one of the economists who you interviewed for the film, a guy named Fred Mishkin, he did the interview, and he said he regretted it because you had predetermined his role. He didn't disclose his fee in a report about Iceland that you discuss in the film, but the amount he was paid is a public record. You could have found it if you had tried to find it. And he says his report came 2 years before Iceland collapsed. What's your reaction to his objections?
Unfortunately, Mr. Mishkin, Professor Mishkin, is being deeply dishonest about this situation. So, first of all, with regard to disclosure, universities and journals do not require disclosure, and the only reason that we know how much he was paid was that after he wrote that report, he entered the federal government. He became one of the members of the Federal Reserve Board. And if you enter the federal government at a certain level, the federal government legally requires you to disclose what you have been paid over the previous year. And so we know from his federal disclosure form, not from anything voluntarily that he did, not from anything coming from the university system, that he was paid $124,000 to write a paper for the Icelandic Chamber of Commerce that said that Iceland was this wonderful, stable, well-regulated place, when in fact, when he wrote that paper, Iceland's 3 banks had already borrowed 3 times Iceland's GNP and were showering money on themselves and each other in a completely criminal and irresponsible way. In fact, 1 month ago, the former Prime Minister of Iceland was indicted.
So why isn't there, if there exists such a conflict of interest for many of these academics and economists, et cetera, why aren't rules in place to keep this from happening, some kind of safeguard? And there aren't, are there?
There aren't, and that's a very good question. In fact, universities have become complicit in this process because they make a great deal of money from it.
In fact, didn't you interview the head of the economics department at Harvard?
I did.
And he kind of seemed completely oblivious to all this.
He pretended to be oblivious. It's very difficult for me to believe that he was, in fact, oblivious because he has himself been paid large amounts of money to testify in derivatives cases. In fact, he said that in our interview. We didn't put it in the film. And he was formerly president of the American Finance Association. So I think he knows perfectly well that this is going on.
Do the institutions receive money, or do the individuals from the institutions?
Both. Both. They receive very large amounts of money. It's important for university endowments. It's important for departmental budgets. And it's important for university administrations. And the amount of money involved is extremely large.
You sort of talk about a thread from the S&L crisis to the dot-com bubble to the subprime mortgage crisis, and you kind of connect the dots. And if this was going on, or at least it was sort of a slow burn since the early 1980s, why were no red flags raised? I mean, you were talking about a lot of highly intelligent people. I mean, was everybody in collusion? I mean, why didn't anyone say? I know there were some people who said in the documentary, who said, hey, this is going to snowball. This is a really dangerous trend we're seeing. This is going to be a financial disaster. But why wasn't there more of that happening?
Well, do you think money could have something to do with it?
Perhaps.
That, unfortunately, is most of the answer.
But even people in government and...
Many people in government are looking very carefully at what happens to their careers after they leave government and when they can make money. And unfortunately, that's become a very important and powerful factor. And then, of course, politicians also want to get reelected, and they need campaign contributions to get reelected. That also is a very important factor. There have been times, though, when people, even in government, have spoken out about this.
Right, whistleblowers, too, yeah.
And, in fact, very high-level people. Brooksley Born was chairperson of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, very powerful organization. She tried to regulate derivatives in the late 1990s, and she was shut down very, very hard by Robert Rubin and Larry Summers.
Why?
Well, that's a good question. One could, again, fear that money was involved. Perhaps they also sincerely believed this, but shortly after, Robert Rubin, as Treasury Secretary, was deeply involved in several deregulatory pieces of legislation, including banning the regulation of derivatives. He took a position as vice chairman of Citigroup and made over $125 million over the succeeding decade. Larry Summers, his successor as Treasury Secretary, made somewhere between $20 and $40 million from financial services firms while he was president of Harvard. And again, we only know that because when he re-entered the government recently, he was required to file a federal financial disclosure form. There is no disclosure requirement from Harvard, and Harvard refuses to answer questions about these issues.
Do you think that there was also collective greed at work? You know, that individuals may have been getting wealthier, but they saw a lot of other people getting wealthier, and they were like, this is great. Our economy is really thriving. This was, of course, before the everything came crashing down. But everybody's making so much money. I know that there's somebody in the documentary who says it's unprecedented wealth. You know, we were in this era of extraordinary wealth. It was almost like a second Gilded Age. So do you think in some ways people were just thinking that this was okay?
Well, many normal people, of course, thought that it was okay because they were being told that it was okay, and
they were making lots of money too.
Yes, because everybody's house was going up in value, and so you could sell your house for more than you paid for it, and you could borrow against it. So everybody had a wonderful party for a while. But it is very clear that many high-level people on Wall Street knew perfectly well that this was not, in fact, real or sustainable or fair. And we know that they know that because beginning in 2005 and 2006, they started betting against the very securities that they were selling as safe. And you don't do that if you think that you are going to lose money by making those bets. So we know, in fact, that many people in Wall Street were aware that this was basically a Ponzi scheme. And we also know that from another source, which is that if you look at the compensation of senior Wall Street executives, including executives in firms that subsequently collapsed, like Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, what you see, and also Countrywide, what you see is that beginning 3 or 4 years before the collapse of the firms, the senior executives started taking out gigantic quantities of cash. And you don't do that if you think that your company has a radiant future.
You know, it was eye-opening to hear a Fortune writer, Alan Sloan, point out that people were borrowing up to 99.3% of the price of the home they were buying. So, you know, I guess the question is, too, why on earth would a bank give somebody like that, who with absolutely no money, a loan for the full price of an expensive home? And do you put any blame on individuals who are caught up in this feeling that they could, you know, live on credit and live well beyond their means?
Yes, of course.
Because you don't really focus on that at all in the documentary.
That's true. It's there in the film, but it's only there briefly. And so what basically was going on was that there was a gigantic bubble, and it was a bubble that was completely encouraged and driven by the financial system. But of course, when that happens, many ordinary people start thinking that they can profit from it, or they're just unaware of what the nature of it is.
And they're encouraged to exploit it in a way.
And they are. And, you know, we know this about human nature, and that's why it's illegal for normal people to fly jet aircraft, and it's illegal for normal people to possess high explosives, and it's illegal for normal people to have military weapons because, you know, we know that sometimes people can do dangerous things if they're given dangerous things to do.
If they're victimized by predatory lenders?
And, of course, if they're victimized. And there was also a great deal of fraud. And that really hasn't been paid enough attention to. There have been a couple of studies that have indicated, for example, that over 1/3 of all of the people who received subprime, high-interest subprime mortgages during this period actually would have qualified for a less expensive subprime mortgage. But they were steered into subprime mortgages because they were more profitable for the lenders to sell. And because they carried higher interest rates, when the crash came, it was more difficult to repay those loans. And that has a great deal to do with our foreclosure problems.
Investment banks, as we know, as you tell us in this documentary, began buying up those subprime mortgages from lenders and passing them on to companies. Investment banks did it to AIG, who would sell them to investors. And this is where it gets very complicated. And I think the documentary does an excellent job of kind of explaining sort of what happened and what transpired. So we're going to take a look at a clip from the documentary, and then you can maybe elaborate on this.
There was another ticking time bomb in the financial system. AIG, the world's largest insurance company, was selling huge quantities of derivatives called credit default swaps. For investors who owned CDOs, credit default swaps worked like an insurance policy. An investor who purchased a credit default swap paid AIG a quarterly premium. If the CDO went bad, AIG promised to pay the investor for their losses. But unlike regular insurance, speculators could also buy credit default swaps from AIG in order to bet against CDOs they didn't own.
So what role did speculators play, and why did that further complicate the equation here?
Well, actually, the principal speculators in this case were the investment banks, who would sell these securities, and after they had sold these securities, they would then bet on the securities' failure. And Goldman Sachs alone made over $20 billion from its bets against securities in this area, mortgage securities, from AIG. And so many banks and investment banks had done this that in mid-September of 2008, when the markets were collapsing, AIG was faced with the requirement to pay about $15 billion in a single week, and it didn't have the money. So AIG went to the federal government, received $85 billion in that week, and the next day paid out $61 billion, $14 billion of which went to Goldman Sachs.
Do you think the federal government should not have bailed out AIG?
I think the federal government needed to bail out AIG, but it should have done so with many tough conditions.
There were some conditions. What conditions would you have liked to have seen that didn't exist at the time?
The conditions that were imposed were in the wrong direction. One of the conditions of AIG's getting the money was Geithner and Paulson forced AIG to give up its right to sue the investment banks for fraud, for misrepresentation of the value and security of the securities that they had bought insurance against. What should have been done is there should have been very, very tight controls on executive compensation. There should have been clawbacks of the compensation that people had received. The people in AIG who sold these credit default swaps received almost $4 billion in cash while they were selling these things that would end up costing AIG over $100 billion. And they've still kept all of that money. And then, of course, perhaps the most important thing is that the government should have forced the investment banks to take substantial discounts. And they had the power to do that, and they didn't.
I talked to a friend of mine who's in banking about the executive compensation. His argument was, listen, the people who were responsible for this in the departments, they all got fired. And basically some of the people in the other divisions, this wasn't their area at all. So you can't necessarily paint them with one broad brush. All the people who got bonuses, for example, who were promised bonuses when they came into their jobs. So what would you say to that?
Well, there are several things to say about it. First of all, a very substantial fraction of the people in these investment banks knew what was going on and were profiting from it and even were involved in it. It was not something
not one division?
Yeah, it was not confined to some tiny little corner.
I don't think he was suggesting it was a tiny little corner, but he was suggesting the people who were directly doing this all got canned.
In many cases they did. In many cases they didn't. and in fact, there are some remarkably scandalous things in that regard. So Countrywide, for example, which was not an investment bank, it was one of the worst mortgage lenders. Countrywide's executives drove it into the ground while making enormous amounts of money personally. Countrywide was then acquired by Bank of America, and the number 2 guy in Countrywide was promptly appointed by Bank of America to run all of Bank of America's mortgage operations. So, the idea that all of these people have paid a huge price is absolutely wrong, and even those who got fired got to keep all the money that they'd made in the previous decade, which was in many cases tens or hundreds of millions of dollars per person, totaling literally hundreds of billions of dollars throughout the entire industry. And there has not been any attempt by the Obama administration to get any of that money back.
What about criminal charges? No one has faced, as you point out, none of these executives has faced criminal charges. Do you think, did they violate the law? Or are we talking about more severe ethical lapses?
Well, we don't know yet because there hasn't been any thorough public investigation or any thorough public disclosure of what occurred. But we do know a lot about what occurred, and as a practical matter, it seems inconceivable that there was not a large quantity of criminal fraud. Now, I have to say, one of the most shocking things that I discovered when I was making this film is that it is actually not ipso facto illegal to create a security and then sell it with the intent from the beginning
to make money?
Making money by betting against it, by betting on the failure of the security that you are selling to somebody as safe. That is not in and of itself illegal. I think it should be, but it's not. As a practical matter, though, to do that with tens of billions of dollars of securities over multiple years while telling the truth to everybody is impossible. There had to be a lot of lying. And if you lie about that sort of thing, that's criminal fraud. And there has not been a single criminal charge.
Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think the Obama administration hasn't been more aggressive pursuing, A, what you mentioned, getting some of this money back, or B, filing criminal charges against some of the people who are directly involved?
Well, there's one answer. In one regard, there's a very clear answer, and then there's another regard in which it's a very deep mystery. The obvious part is that once President Obama had appointed the people that he appointed to run his economic team and his administration, it was very unlikely that there was going to be any serious prosecutions because his economic team is composed of people who caused this crisis, some of whom may even have criminal liability, some of whom, for example, were involved in betting against the securities that they had sold. So, that's the obvious part. Depressing, but obvious. The mystery, the big mystery, is why did President Obama appoint these people? And it is something that is, in fact, deeply mysterious because during his campaign, he said many things that indicated that he was going to do something serious about this problem. And he's obviously a very intelligent man. What people have told me, I don't know myself, what people have told me is that they think that he was insecure about his own level of understanding and experience because he had no economic or financial experience. He had no private sector experience. And therefore, when the country was in this deep financial crisis, he was the prisoner of the people around him who perhaps he did not realize had played such a major role in causing this problem. But now here we are 2 years later, and that can't be an excuse anymore. And I very much hope that President Obama can change his mind about this.
Do you think Tim Geithner is going to be deep-sixed?
I don't know.
Should he be?
Yes. He should not have been appointed in the first place. He was the president of the New York Fed during the entire period of the bubble. He did nothing whatsoever about it. When the crisis began, his conduct was in every way favorable towards the banks. He did not make any attempt whatsoever to take back any of the compensation these people had received. And when he was bailing out AIG, he forced AIG to give up its right to sue. There are many indications that this man should not be the Treasury Secretary.
What about Alan Greenspan? I mean, he's kind of portrayed as a villain in this movie. I mean, Greenspan, Hank Paulson, Larry Summers. I asked this a little bit earlier, but how did they not see this impending doom at all? I mean, do you go back to the whole argument that they were profiting from it, or they were worried about their own hides once they left government and went into private life again? Because Hank Paulson is a fairly modest guy, I think, as far as I know. I don't think he's making boatloads of money now, is he?
Paulson is a complicated guy. You know, I don't know him personally. I wish I could be Henry Paulson's psychoanalyst, because I would love to understand better what's going on. I think that he does still care about making money. It's very clear that he cares deeply about his public reputation. And I think that part of what's going on could well be that he wants to try to save his reputation, and he couldn't save his reputation if he told the truth. I've read his memoir. His memoir is deeply dishonest. It's a combination of evasions and leaving things out, and occasionally very damning admissions, which are kind of slipped in sideways and then excused. If you read his memoir carefully, you will see him admit that when he forced Lehman Brothers into bankruptcy, he did not understand what the consequences of that would be. He had not done his homework. And then, of course, there's the question of how he behaved when he was CEO of Goldman Sachs, when he was deeply complicit in selling these securities, and also deeply complicit in lobbying the federal government to relax its regulations over the previous decade. So it would be very difficult psychologically for a person in that position to admit that he had been so wrong and his actions had been so destructive over a 10-year period. And it's perhaps too much to expect of a human being who's done that to tell the truth afterwards.
Do you think most of these guys are kind of delusional in terms of the role they played in this?
No, I think that quietly, privately, they understand all too well. And I don't think it's coincidence, for example, that none of them agreed to be interviewed. I tried very hard to interview these people, and some of them I know. I know Larry Summers. Not well, but, I've dealt with him at various times.
None of the big players agreed to be interviewed.
None of the CEOs agreed to be interviewed, and nobody in the Obama administration agreed to be interviewed.
And the investment bank presidents?
None. I was able to speak with a few of them off the record, off camera. John Thain, for example, who I've known for a long time. I had many private conversations with him, and I told him that I would not reveal their content, and so I won't. But I also tried very hard to get him and others to agree to on-camera interviews. And in fact, I told John and I told several other people that if they agreed to be interviewed, that after I interviewed them, I would give them 3 minutes in the film, uninterrupted, unedited, to say anything that they wanted. None of them agreed. None.
Let me ask you real quickly about the ratings agencies. We got a question from somebody who tweeted us and said, why do large banks, pension funds still trust the rating agencies? Why does the government insure investment banks or banks that trust them? And I know that you talked about all these companies that failed had pretty good, strong ratings, credit ratings from big companies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's. In fact, we have a clip about that. Let's watch it real quickly.
Bear Stearns was rated AAA like a month before it went bankrupt?
More likely A2.
A2?
Yeah.
Okay. A2 is still not bankrupt?
No, it's a high investment grade, solid investment grade rating. Lehman Brothers, A2 within days of failing, AIG, AA within days of being bailed out. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were AAA when they were rescued. Citigroup, Merrill, all of them had investment grade ratings.
How can that be?
Well, that's a good question.
Ha ha ha. But kind of not funny, kind of disturbing. And how did you determine how that could be?
Well, once again, money had a great deal to do with it. Rating agencies are actually extraordinarily powerful, much more so than people realize. And they get paid by the issuers of securities. So when Goldman Sachs was getting ready to sell a security, it would pay a rating agency to give it a rating. And what a surprise if that turned out to be a good rating. And those same rating agencies also rate the investment banks themselves. And here's where their political power comes in. They also rate government securities. So it's actually very, very dangerous to cross a rating agency.
So basically everybody's in bed with everybody in this business.
I don't know. In some cases...
I mean, it sure sounds like it.
In some cases, it's a matter of being in bed with, and in other cases, it's a matter of being hostage to. And it's a combination of the two. And this system, this problem, has grown up over the last 30 years. And yes, now, unfortunately, it's very deeply embedded in the American political system and the American economy. At the height of the bubble in the mid-2000s, financial services accounted for 40% of all corporate profits in the United States. I mean, that's crazy. That's crazy.
So what is the answer? I mean, what is the solution? Somebody asked us on Twitter, do you think the government's done enough to correct the loopholes that caused the downfall? I know your answer to that is no. But has financial regulatory reform taken even baby steps towards protecting us from having this happen again?
I would say baby steps, but only baby steps. So we're not going to have a problem like this anytime in the next few years. But could this happen again a decade from now, 15 years from now? Yes, it could. And many people are very concerned about that. So first of all, something has to be done about that. And then, of course, the most difficult, most painful problem in American politics now is the role of money in politics. And until we do something about the role of money in politics, I think that we're going to continue to struggle with this issue.
So you don't think it's going to change?
Not soon. Not until the American people force their leaders to take very fundamental action. I'm optimistic that that will occur. It's happened before in America. That's what
maybe that would be a different Tea Party movement.
Yes. Yeah, it would be, that's what the civil rights movement was. That's what the environmental movement was. It's what the progressive movement was a century ago. So I don't think that it's impossible. I'm not pessimistic about that. But unfortunately, President Obama, when he was elected, had a historically very rare, special, unique opportunity. And unfortunately, he let it pass for whatever reason. And now that he has let it pass, it's going to be a much more difficult, gradual thing to correct this problem.
Do you think the Tea Party philosophy is to keep government and politicians from being beholden to these special interests? I mean, I think they would argue that's part of their philosophy.
I hope so, and if so, then I'm in complete agreement with it. Where I part company with them is in their view that government should simply get out of the way. We tried that with the financial system, and it didn't work out too well. So, I think that unfortunately government has to have an important regulatory role.
And finally, you got some great reviews, so congratulations on that. But one reviewer took issue with your last line, writing, "Inside job ends on a muckraking note. Some things are worth fighting for," which calls for what? Revolution? Anarchy? End quote. What does that last line mean?
Well, I'm certainly not calling for revolutionary anarchy. I'm not an anarchist type. I have been a business person. Before that, I was an academic. Anarchy is not my style.
But what are you calling for? Some things are worth fighting for. So how does the average citizen fight this kind of corruption?
Well, unfortunately, since it is a bipartisan problem, right now it has to be through channels other than the principal political parties. And people have made many different suggestions about this. There already are some organizations that work on these issues and also work on the issue of money in politics. And on the film's website, there's a list of them. I think new organizations have to be created, and what people can do, and perhaps a new political party. I don't know. That in a way that's not my department. I view my role as I'm an investigative journalist, and I'm showing people, and I hope I'm benefiting the country by showing people what happened here. and I certainly believe that something has to be done about it. But I'm actually not a political person, and so I'm perhaps not the best person to give advice about that. People have said perhaps a third political party, perhaps an independent social movement, more like the civil rights movement or more like the environmental movement. I was very cheered, I have to say, by some of the things that I've seen recently in response to the film, some of the things that people have written in response to the film, and that indicate to me that there are, in fact, many people in America who are upset about this problem and willing to spend time and energy working on it, but they are not yet organized. And so if someone emerges, or if some organization emerges to organize America's energies, I think that would be a wonderful thing.
Well, Charles Ferguson, the movie is called Inside Job. Thank you so much for coming in and rehashing what's in the film, and I hope a lot of people will go and see it, because I think you do a great job of really kind of explaining very complicated concepts for, I think, everyone to kind of understand the lay of the land. We never really talked about what a derivative was, but people can find out more when they watch the documentary. Thanks a lot. I appreciate your coming in.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to all of you for watching. Now, by the way, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @KatieCouric, and you can see all the episodes of this web show anytime at cbsnews.com. And now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.